There comes a point in a woman's life when she becomes exhausted from offering explanations to people who were never listening in the first place. She spent years softening her tone, choosing careful words, rewriting her sentences in her mind, so no one would misunderstand her intentions. She apologized for feelings that were real, for needs that were human, for boundaries she had every right to set. She thought that if she explained herself clearly enough, patiently enough, lovingly enough, someone would finally understand her heart. But instead, she discovered something painful. Some people aren't waiting for clarity. They're waiting for the opportunity to dismiss it. She explained her silence, only to be told she was distant. She explained her hurt, only to be told she was too sensitive. She explained her boundaries, only to be told she was difficult. She explained her dreams, only to be told they were unrealistic. And with every explanation, a part of her disappeared. A little of her voice, a little of her confidence, a little of her trust in herself. She became fluent in defending her own emotions as if they were crimes and not the quiet truths of her inner world. But something shifted. It didn't happen in a dramatic moment. It happened in silence, a deep, honest silence, where she finally realized that the people who cared never needed explanations, and the people who demanded them never truly cared. On that day, she felt something inside her loosen, something heavy she had carried for years, a weight she didn't even realize had been shaping her every word. She breathed, she sat with her truth, and she whispered to herself, with a strength she didn't know she still had, "I don't owe anyone an explanation for being myself." And for the first time, those words felt like freedom. Before we dive deeper into her journey, into the courage it takes to stop defending who you are and start honoring who you've always been, I want to gently invite you to stay. If these words resonate with you, if they touch a quiet part of your life you rarely show, consider subscribing, not for numbers, but for the simple reason that you deserve a place where your heart feels understood. Now, let's talk about what happens when a woman finally stops explaining herself. Before she ever stopped explaining herself, she spent years doing the opposite, years bending, twisting, compressing her voice into something smaller and softer, just so it wouldn't be misunderstood. She became an expert in emotional translation. She translated her pain into politeness, her disappointment into silence, her boundaries into apologies, her needs into whispered, indirect hints, so she wouldn't inconvenience anyone. She learned early on that people praised her more when she made herself easy to handle, when she didn't disagree, when she didn't express discomfort, when she held her emotions tightly so others didn't have to deal with them. And so, she adapted. She lowered her volume so others wouldn't feel challenged. She dimmed her feelings so others wouldn't feel guilty. She made her yes louder and her no nearly invisible. She apologized before speaking, during speaking, and after speaking, just in case her existence took up more space than someone else preferred. The world taught her that being understood required being agreeable, that clarity required being gentle to the point of self-erasure, that peace meant swallowing her truth so others could stay comfortable, and every time someone dismissed what she felt, she worked harder to explain it. Every time someone twisted her meaning, she tried again, with more softness, more patience, more self-sacrifice. She believed the misunderstanding was her fault, that if she had chosen better words, a calmer tone, a clearer explanation, maybe someone would finally hear her. But misunderstandings were never the problem. The problem was that she was surrounded by people who only listened to respond, not to understand. People who wanted her compliance, not her truth. People who confused her compassion with an invitation to take advantage. And slowly, without noticing it, she began to disappear inside her own life. She felt it in the mirror. A woman who looked familiar, but somehow smaller. She felt it in conversations. Moments where she spoke, yet felt like she wasn't allowed to exist fully. She felt it in her chest, that quiet, constant ache of living a life edited for someone else's comfort. But even then, even in that shrinking, there was a part of her that refused to die, a part that kept whispering, "You shouldn't have to explain your right to exist." For years she ignored that whisper. She didn't yet know that it was the voice of her own strength, waiting for its moment to rise. There comes a moment, usually quiet, subtle, almost unremarkable, when a woman finally sees the truth she has been avoiding for years. It was never about the explanation. She could choose the most careful words, wrap her thoughts in tenderness, pour her heart out in a way that made her vulnerable and honest. And still, some people would look at her with blank eyes and closed hearts. They weren't listening. They were waiting for a chance to defend themselves, waiting to twist her meaning into something convenient, waiting to turn her feelings into accusations she never made, waiting to redirect the conversation so they wouldn't have to take responsibility. She would explain her hurt, and they would say she was exaggerating. She would explain her boundaries, and they would say she was being dramatic. She would explain what she needed, and they would make her feel guilty for asking. It didn't matter how sincere she was. It didn't matter how softly she spoke. It didn't matter how many chances she gave, or how many times she rewrote her sentences to appear calm, reasonable, acceptable. Some people simply didn't want to understand her. Understanding her would require effort. It would require humility. It would require them to look at the ways they hurt her and choose to do better. And that wasn't something they were willing to do. But she didn't realize this at first. She kept trying, kept explaining, clarifying, softening, shrinking, believing that the next explanation would finally make someone listen, until one ordinary day, mid-conversation, mid-sentence, mid-explanation, something inside her went quiet. Not defeated, just done. It was a silence that didn't ask permission, a silence that wasn't afraid, a silence that didn't need validation. It simply arrived, gentle but firm, like a truth she had been carrying for years, but never dared to look at directly. In that moment, she saw everything clearly. People who wanted to understand her never needed long explanations. People who valued her didn't require her to defend her feelings. People who respected her didn't make her prove her worth. And people who truly loved her never made her justify who she was. The problem was never her words. The problem was where she was placing them. She realized she had been pouring her heart into hands that were never open, speaking her truth into walls that refused to listen, offering clarity to people invested in misunderstanding her. And once she saw that truth, really saw it, something in her shifted forever. Explanations no longer felt like connection. They felt like chains. And she was finally ready to let them fall. It took her far too long to realize that she was the one carrying most of her relationships, with explanations no one truly asked for, and vulnerability no one genuinely held. She wasn't just explaining herself. She was compensating for the emotional work that others refused to do. She filled in the silence, so no one felt uncomfortable. She interpreted hints, so no one had to speak plainly. She softened truths, so no one had to face their own behavior. She connected the dots, read between lines, listened deeply, and tried to meet people where they were, even when no one bothered to meet her halfway. Every conversation felt like emotional labor, her choosing careful words, anticipating reactions, managing tones, preventing conflict, holding space for the feelings of others, while her own feelings waited at the back of the line. She thought this was kindness. She thought this was maturity. She thought this was love. But love that requires you to disappear is not love. It is survival. And she had been surviving for so long that she forgot what honest connection was supposed to feel like. She began to notice the ache after certain conversations, the heaviness that sat in her chest long after she closed the door or ended the call, not because she said too much, but because she said everything, while the other person said nothing real at all. She noticed the imbalance, how she listened with empathy, but was met with indifference, how she shared her heart, but received surface-level answers, how she tried to build understanding, but stood alone on the foundation. She realized she had been explaining herself not to be understood, but to keep relationships alive that would have died without her effort. And that truth hurt. It pierced her. It humbled her. But it also freed her, because once she saw how much energy she spent carrying connections that weren't mutual, she began to understand why she was always so tired, not just emotionally, but spiritually, physically, deeply. We were not created to carry relationships alone. Dialogue is meant to be a bridge, not a burden. Understanding is meant to be shared, not extracted. And in her exhaustion, in her quiet realization, she asked herself a question. That changed everything. If they wanted to understand me, would they really need this many explanations? The answer was clear, spoken not by her mind, but by the heaviness in her chest. No. And that truth became the first doorway to her freedom. There wasn't a grand announcement, no dramatic shift, no sudden rebellion. Her transformation arrived quietly, the same way her exhaustion had, soft, steady, undeniable. It came in the form of a decision, so subtle that no one else noticed, yet so powerful that it changed the way she moved through the world. She stopped trying to make people see her, stopped trying to make them believe her, stopped rehearsing explanations in her mind, preparing defenses for feelings she no longer wanted to justify. Instead, she turned inward. She listened to her own voice, a voice she had silenced for years, because she thought harmony was more important than honesty. And what she heard was simple, gentle, and profoundly true. You don't need to explain yourself to be valid. You don't need permission to feel what you feel. You don't need to earn understanding. You don't need to convince anyone of your worth. Those were truths she had forgotten. While trying to be acceptable, reasonable, unoffensive, misunderstandable proof, she realized that the people meant for her never asked her to shrink. They never challenged her feelings, never doubted her boundaries, never made her prove her sincerity. Over and over again, the right people understand her, in the spaces between her words. They don't require perfection. They don't call her complicated. Just because she has depth, they don't demand explanations as payment for connection. And the wrong people? They drain her, not because she's hard to understand, but because they were never willing to see her clearly. So she chose herself. She chose peace over performance, honesty over approval, self-respect over endless justification, boundaries over bending, clarity over confusion, stillness over emotional chaos. She started saying no without explaining why. She started saying, "I don't want this," without listing the reasons. She started leaving conversations where her voice had to fight to exist, and for the first time in a long time, her silence wasn't fear. It was freedom. She discovered that life becomes lighter when she no longer tries to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding her. Her energy shifted. Her presence changed. Her soul breathed again. And in that quiet day of choosing herself, she learned something sacred. A woman doesn't lose anything when she stops explaining herself. She only loses the people who were never meant to stay. And that loss is actually the beginning of her true belonging. There comes a moment in a woman's life when her clarity becomes louder than her fear, and her peace becomes more important than being understood by the wrong people. When she reaches that moment, something shifts inside her. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way so honest that it changes the direction of her entire life. She stops chasing understanding. She stops overthinking her words. She stops rehearsing conversations that never should have required explanations in the first place. She stops walking on emotional eggshells to protect people who never protected her. She stops apologizing for her boundaries, her dreams, her voice, her heart. She realizes that the people who truly value her never needed her to explain her worth. They never twisted her intentions. They never punished her honesty or dismissed her emotions. They welcomed her truth without asking her to shrink it. And once she tastes that kind of peace, the peace of standing in her truth, without apology, without defense, without the weight of constant explanation, she refuses to go back. She outgrows the spaces that demanded her silence. She outgrows the relationships that depended on her guilt. She outgrows the roles that forced her to justify her existence. And she finally steps into a life where her voice is not a burden, but a compass, where her boundaries are not questioned, but respected, where her truth is not an inconvenience, but a home. If you're listening to this and something in your heart feels understood, if a part of you feels seen, in the quiet places you rarely show, I want to gently invite you to continue walking with me, not out of obligation, not out of routine, but because you deserve a space that reminds you, week after week, that your voice matters, your feelings matter, your boundaries matter, and you never have to explain your own truth to earn the right to be heard. So if this message held you in a way the world rarely does, consider subscribing, not to follow a channel, but to follow your healing. Here, you are welcome. Here, you are seen. Here, you don't have to explain yourself anymore. Your journey toward freedom has already begun.